Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Cranbourne East Secondary Podcast. Per usual, you have me, Mr. L. We also have
Me, Mr. Young, and our special guest.
a special guest, which on my camera is down there today. We have
Mr. Porter,
Mr. Porter. Thank you very much for joining us today, Mr. Porter.
you are very welcome.
Thank you.
It's about time you had me on this podcast.
I know,
I've been
right?
waiting for months for this.
We have so many clashes and then so many lockdowns. And as you viewers can see, once again, we are stuck at home. Last week, we were able to record one final time without face mask with Mr. Schmerling. And so I think we've done an upgrade this week. What do you reckon, Mr. Young?
Yeah, definitely. It's a really good upgrade. It's a very welcome upgrade.
With Mr. Schmerling, you probably needed the face mask. So, can you edit that out?
No, that's all right. That's all right. Mr. Porter, just for any students who may not have had you as a teacher before, what do you teach at our school?
Okay, so at the moment, I'm teaching exclusively science, right? All the way. Well, I don't have any year sevens this year, but I've got year eights. But my specialty in science is physics. So I've got the year 12 physics class at the moment, and I bounce between the year 12 and the year 11 physics class. And I do teach maths on the odd occasion. It's been a few years since I had a maths class, so it's all science at the moment. And STEM as well. I've got two
definitely.
STEM classes.
Definitely. And when you talk about STEM, I can instantly look at your background and I can just see the amount of tech that you have there.
I've got a lot of tech in here.
Would you like to introduce to us what is on your, looking over there. On my screen, it's left, but I think it might be flipped. It looks like a headset of some sort. Is that an Oculus?
Yeah. So I've got my Oculus Rift S there. Yeah, I've had that for about, almost a year now.
Yep.
I've got two large PCs. One I use as a server when I host online games. And this is my main game machine here. You can see it's got joystick and HOTAS because I do a lot of online flight sim games. It's got a head tracker. In fact, in the background, I'm going to fire it up in the background.
Sure.
I've actually set up one of the games I play, and that'll be in the background. It's a good thing. Give me 1 second.
Yeah, no problem. So as you can see, wow, the crazy amount of text viewers. So we've got the Oculus and flight simulations.
It'll be a nice background. Oh, yeah. I love my flight simulators. Yeah, aviation is a very a love of mine that dates way, way back, and actually dragged out some of my aviation history to show you guys. I found my pilot's logbook.
Oh, wow. You got your logbook.
When I flew, and I even found the picture of the aircraft I first flew when I was learning to, because I did learn to fly way, way back when I was a teenager.
Yep.
So I dragged some of that history out to show.
Yeah, it's awesome to take a look at that. I do have some friends that I think they were doing similar things, but I know there's some in, I forgot, was it up north? I think they're all up north because there's none in the southeastern area, is there, in terms of places where you can fly, is there?
Oh, no. So, for example, here in Melbourne, if you were learning to fly up the Moorabbin Airport, it's very, 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 it's very, very busy. Here in near Cranbourne, you'd be probably learning to fly at Tyab. And there's a great air show there that they run every 2 years. Okay. So for our students, if they're interested in air shows, the closest one would be the Tyab air show. They run that every 2 years or so, generally in March. So there are quite a few places to fly around Melbourne. The really good weather, though, is north of the ranges. So Mangalore Airport near Shepparton in Victoria is a very popular place to train flying, and there are lots of aviation museums and such in probably the best aviation museum in Australia with flying aircraft is at it's near Tamworth.
Yep.
The name of it, yeah, that's up there where they have that's a lot of flying aircraft. The best museum for aircraft in Australia is actually at Point Cook, over the other side of the city. It's the RAAF Museum there. They've got some fantastic stuff there. If you're interested in aviation, that is a great day out. And there's one at Moorabbin too, an excellent little museum there that's got some great stuff. So,
awesome. So, would you like to show us your first aircraft that you've flown in first? And we'll start with the history of flight. And then
I actually found a picture of the actual aircraft. So I haven't used Zoom for ages. How do I share?
Okay, let me allow you to share your screen. I will make you the host. There we go. You should have the controls now.
Share screen. Just share that photo. Can you guys see that?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, okay. So that's actually the aircraft I learned to fly in when I was 17.
17.
So I did about 20 hours of flying training when between the ages of 17 and 18.
Mm-hmm.
And then it became too expensive. I couldn't continue with it. And then it's not a cheap hobby.
I would imagine so.
So the reason I was able to do it is I actually got a scholarship. I was in the Air Cadets, the Air Training Corps at the time. And I won a statewide award. So I got 20 hours of flying training for free. And the unit I was based with was at the East Sale Air Force Base. I was actually taught to fly by a couple of the roulettes, the guys who do the part of our Australian aerobatics team. Obviously, they're not in the roulettes anymore because they'd be like in their 80s.
Yeah.
Now the guys who trained me. But that's the aircraft I actually learned to fly in, Mike Foxtrot Oscar. And I have my logbook here. I'll stop sharing that.
Yep.
And so this is my ancient logbook, very yellowed. It's a long time. And here's my first solo flight. You probably can't see it, but I flew solo when I was 17 and a half years old. I actually flew a plane by myself before I drove a car by myself. So you can actually learn to fly at the age of 16 in Australia. You can fly before you drive.
Wow. I was about to ask that. Yeah, I was about to ask, did you learn to drive first or did you learn to fly first? But then now you've explained it.
I knew how to drive, and I'm going to admit that I grew up in the country, so I did do my share of driving paddock bashes around. Yeah. So I could drive, but I hadn't legally driven by myself on the roads before I had actually flown legally by myself.
Cool.
What was the training like?
So it was really interesting. It was probably not typical of what the regular training you would get at a civilian establishment, because they were RAAF instructors. It wasn't. They on the weekends they had their own flying club. So during the week they flew as Air Force pilots and as roulettes, but on the weekends they ran their own flying club, which they did do quite a bit of training. So it was somewhat different from. I did a little bit of civilian training, a little bit. Probably my last 5 hours, I trained with some civilian pilots in my hometown in Bairnsdale, and the training was very different. They were training me as if I was an Air Force cadet. So that was really it was fantastic. Very, very high standard, and they scared me to death. Yeah. they were proper fighter pilots. They weren't. They were, because the pilots who fly at East Sale, which is their base to the east of Melbourne, are the best pilots in the RAAF. They're actually people who've done several tours as fighter or bomber pilots. And they go to East Sale to learn to fly with the roulettes, and they are the very best pilots that Australia has. So they were fantastic and great people to get to know.
That's awesome to hear. So what I would want to ask, I want to just start with the history of flight that you had first, because I would also want to hear your thoughts on the evolution of aviation and flight over these past few years, especially now into the world of drones as well. Going from actually piloting yourself to remote piloting. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that it's a direction that is a good direction that we're going in? Do you think that human flight might be redundant one day? What are your thoughts?
I think that it might well become redundant, although most pilots would hate to even be thinking about this. So there is at the moment, and you can see it in both the military and civilian spheres, this move now towards remote piloting. At the moment, it's still two different worlds. Yep. So the drone world is a very different world from the piloting world. And that's mainly because the piloting world is very resistant to the idea that automatic aircraft are going to be a thing. I think it's inevitable that they are. The reality for a modern passenger aircraft is that they essentially, the only thing they actually need the pilots for is for taxiing to the end of the runway. And the moment they get to the beginning of the runway, or when they land and they turn off the runway, it can all be automatic. The aircraft will take off, fly to a destination and land completely automatically.
Wow.
They just don't taxi automatically. That's the only thing that pilots are actually needed for. And though nobody really wants to admit that is in fact the truth. But at the moment, the drone world is very much it's the smaller drones. There are lots of restrictions and rules about how to operate drones. Whether they're reasonable or not is a big question. There are some pretty big safety reasons why drones need to be controlled, because at the moment they're not connected to the rest of our air traffic. So our air traffic control system is absolutely focused around the light planes and the big passenger jets and the military jets that are moving around the skies, and they don't take any account of drones themselves. And there is a big problem in that you can't mix those two things. You can't have people in aircraft and drones mixing it all. So there's quite a bit of resistance there. Drones can certainly be completely autonomous. You can buy a Maverick drone that will fly from point to point completely automatically. You don't need to be controlling it at all. And there's even really like a simple indoor drone like this one here. This essentially flies itself. Okay, so I can connect to this with Bluetooth on my iPhone. I can press a button, it will take off, it will hover in a particular point. I can press another button and it'll move a precise direction. Right? And this one controls itself using some optical sensors. Larger ones will use GPS, completely autonomous. A drone pilot can literally push the buttons as to where their drone goes. And the things people are using them for at the moment are things like accessing remote areas, doing photography, surveying, and it's not really mixing with what the rest of aviation is doing. But I think it's inevitable that we'll see some sort of mixing of the two. But I think there will be a lot of resistance, and I don't think it will happen as quickly. I think we're going to see self-driving cars long before we see completely automated passenger carrying aircraft. I think it'll actually move from cars into aviation.
Okay.
That's where I actually see it going. I think we're going to be much more comfortable because we already have in the United States and in some places in Germany, you're able to turn the autopilot on your car on. And while you have to monitor it, it is, and not in every place. There are only some places where that you do this, certainly not in Australia yet. You can hands off, right? And as long as you're monitoring what's happening, your car will drive itself.
Wow.
And I think that will lead to eventually that introduction into aviation. But I think it'll be a longer haul than people think. And I think that if anyone is thinking about an aviation career, at least now, I think you're pretty safe. Right? I think that there'll be a huge demand for pilots when international travel picks up again. There was a huge shortage of pilots just before COVID hit. There was massive recruiting campaigns being undertaken, and then it all fell apart. I think now I think we'll probably have a 3-year gap in international travel. During that 3 year, thousands of pilots will retire because a lot of pilots are getting quite old. So I think when international travel starts up again, there will be an incredible demand for pilots. So if people are thinking about an aviation career, at least in the next 5 or 6 years, I think it's pretty safe to start. In 10, 20 years' time, who knows? There may not be any need for pilot training in 10, 20 years' time, but I think there's still a window for people to get involved in aviation. But because I think the changes will happen much more slowly than a lot of people think.
Exactly. Because I remember one of the videos that I was watching of sharing new technology, there was I was watching a video where there was some drones where they didn't even need to land to be charged. Like they could just fly over a certain area and then they could just be recharged. And I was thinking, that's some Skynet stuff right there, isn't it? It's like...
Fascinatingly enough, that's 1950s technology.
Is it now? Wow.
Yes, so it's rather interesting. I actually did a research project in this when I was at university.
Wow.
Yes, I did, So you transmit power using a microwave. It's essentially the same as a microwave oven. It's just a directed beam. And the aircraft, in this case, they were drone aircraft as well, that they tested this in the 50s, had an antenna system on the bottom that instead of just picking up the signals, the information, they picked up power. So they had an experimental system in the 1950s where they had, and it was a drone aircraft, that would fire in circles, and the microwave would keep pointing at it and just keep charging it up.
Oh, wow. Being able to, having to land, it can charge.
Yep. And so, so that technology it's not exactly the same technology as the wireless chargers you put your iPhone on top of. All right. So there's something, there's a difference in the way that the signal's being transmitted from one to the other. But you can imagine, if you want to picture it, that's a pretty good way of picturing it, similar to those charging pads, but over a longer distance.
That's cool.
Yeah, so that is interesting. It is tough that it's been around for quite a while. Very cool though. Yeah. So there's no reason that a drone wouldn't be able to hover over a microwave transmitter and recharge its batteries pretty quickly too.
That's cool. Mr. Young, since you also teach STEM as well, is this anywhere near what you're teaching your kids at the moment, or?
Currently, no. Like currently what we're going through is we're making spaghetti machine, which like if you don't know what the spaghetti machine is, it's this task that we have for our year 10s where they have to build a machine that has at least 12 energy conversions to do a simple task. So for us, we're trying to convey a message using our energy conversions. And so, yeah, that's what we're trying to build right now. So far, it's nowhere near close to aviation. But we are actually going to be looking at some form of aviation later on as well. So that might be stuff. We're also looking into using drones as well. And we're also looking at just the forces that allow for us to make mini rockets as well, but in more of a latitude or like a horizontal motion than launching it into the space or like launching into the air, which is...
We're going to be trying doing that in the year 9 STEM class later in this year. So what obviously Mr. Young and I have been talking about how we can have an aviation theme in the STEM classes, how we can start it in year 9 and then move it into the year 10 STEM classes. We're very excited about having rockets and drones as part of the topics that we cover. Very cool.
And I feel like, Mr. Porter, you got famous rocket stories. Like whenever teachers talk about rockets and like rocket launching, they always talk about Mr. Porter, I feel like.
I've launched so it's been a couple of years since I've launched rockets at CESC. That will change later this year. So later this year, I'll probably disrupt quite a few classes, particularly in the green building. They'll be able to see out under the oval and they'll see us launching some rockets in year 9. Nice. Yeah, so I've launched a number of them, both here and at my old school. Sure, a couple of rockets have ended up in people's backyards, but nobody's been hurt.
That's the key thing.
That's the way it happens. Rockets, we fire fairly powerful rockets that use a self-contained engine, a gunpowder engine that is been used in model rocketry since the 1950s now. So they're basically a little cartridge. They're incredibly safe and incredibly reliable. But they do go pretty high. There is a limit to how high they're allowed to go. You're only allowed to fly a rocket up to about 500 feet without a special permit. Same thing with a drone as well. There's very strict rules on how high a drone can be allowed to fly because it gets into the controlled airspace. But the wind can come along and pick up the rockets once their parachutes are deployed, and they may disappear, but they're on a parachute. They're not going to hurt anyone when they land. So.
Yeah, that's like one of the main things we have to look into for when we're doing this unit. So it's like just making sure we're abiding by the whole like airspace rules and all of that. So yeah, but it's extremely fun. I actually wouldn't mind, like if I was in the green building, I 100% would not mind if my kids saw you firing off rockets.
I'll hold you to that.
I'll end my lesson.
When your whole class is watching the rockets and not listening to you.
I'll just be like, look, we're done here. We're gonna go out and watch.
Not at our school, but I did at one of my old schools. I had some complaints when I was launching rockets on the oval. Yeah, I had some teachers that complained that I was disrupting their educational program by distracting the students with the big loud whooshes and the smoke plumes.
Maybe those teachers weren't interesting enough.
No, I've had friends who teach at other schools, and what they do is they actually like go on a full-on excursion way outside Metro Australia or Victoria, and then they fire off their rockets as like.
There's some really cool programs out there, where you can launch them. because if you get the right permits, you can launch very powerful rockets.
Wow. Cool.
As long as there are no aircraft in the area at the time and you have a permit.
Of course, making sure.
That'd be one hell of a report to write.
Yeah. So one extra thing I did want to ask you about drones with Mr. Porter is I remember you sharing about how you have a friend that works with drones, but in the film industry. So do you want to elaborate for our listeners how drones are being used in the film industry these days?
Well, it is fascinating because the film industry has, for a very long time, used helicopters and aircraft for a lot of the shots that they make. And of course, that's quite expensive. Now, the company that he works for does have a whole bunch of different aircraft that they use for particular shots, but they've increasingly started to develop drone technology to make the shots that they do. So if, for example, you have, and I'll use an example because he recently came back from Norway filming Mission Impossible 7. Right? And they had designed the drones. What they do is really fascinating. They will build a drone from scratch using 3D printing and computer-controlled milling, specifically for one shot in a movie. And my friend, his speciality is actually he just designs and builds the hand controllers that the drone operators use. So that's his job. And he builds a new hand controller for a single shot in a movie.
Wow.
So his job, he went over to Norway and he had to do the whole quarantine thing in both directions just to make sure the drone operator had the right controls. And so they built the drone for this specific shot. And the shot they were doing was in the news at the time. There's apparently in Mission Impossible 7 a shot where Tom Cruise goes on a ramp across a fjord. Yeah. All right. So he jumps a motorbike across a Norwegian fjord, and they tracked that with they had two different drones apparently following that. And they built the drone specifically to be stable and travel at just the right speed to match his speed in the stuntman's speed in the motorbike. So they'll build an entirely new drone specifically for a shot if that's what they need to do. Yeah, that's quite remarkable. And they are, like many modern companies, they have people all over the world and they have a 24-hour work cycle. So the people in the United States will be working on a problem, and then when they head off home, the problem will move to Australia and they'll build it there in Australia, and they'll design a new, say, a module for the drone or a module for the controller, and they'll send that design to the next section of the company, and they'll 3D print it. Yeah. Right. So they'll actually design the drone all over the world, and then they'll print the parts that they need out in the physical location where they actually need that.
So efficient. So, have you actually seen the film yourself before, Mr. Porter?
Which one?
The Mission Impossible 7.
Oh, no, that's the one that hasn't come out yet. It's a new one that hasn't been released.
Was 6
was the last one.
Yeah,
6 was the last one.
Yeah. So have you seen 6?
Yeah, so 7? I have, yeah.
6.
Yeah, I quite like them. Yeah, they're popcorn movies. They're nothing that you're going to remember forever, but they're very entertaining, highly entertaining movies.
Definitely.
Not going to change the world, though.
Yeah. But yeah, so since we're talking about movies, I guess now we're hitting that time of the show where we're going to talk about recommendations of any movies or TV shows and so on. So maybe I'll start with Mr. Young first to give Mr. Porter a bit more time to think about some suggestions. But Mr. Young,
something that's
I kind of have two now because I have the one I was coming into this where I was going to recommend it, but then this whole conversation has made me want to recommend another type of show. It's not like a specific one, but it's a type. I'll tell you later. So my show that I would recommend for now is if you're a fan of the Marvel Universe, to prepare yourself for the whole new, I guess, new chain of events for Marvel. My recommendation is Loki. So Loki is on Disney Plus. It's following Loki and how he's been set up as a character. My favorite part about the whole series is that it shows Loki and his backstory, or like more about his character instead of just being a villain. So I really, really enjoy those movies where it's like they take a classic cinematic villain and then they give you the backstory of it, and they make you realize that there's actually more to what the original story tells you about. So like stuff like Maleficent, that was amazing just to see like how the villain of Sleeping Beauty had her own massive backstory. Ended up not being the best, but like the whole concept I was like really into. And yeah, that's my first one. I'm not gonna say too much about Loki just because it's a massive spoiler. And then if I spoil that, it's gonna spoil the rest of the Marvel universe. So it's like I'm just gonna keep that bare minimum.
Sure.
The next one is based off of this whole conversation. And I remember myself watching this as a kid. It's all of those like documentaries of like airplane crashes, like mysterious airplane crashes, mainly because back as a kid, I used to go to Hong Kong like every year just to see family. And somehow, for some reason, I'd always be recommended to watch these shows like a
Air
few
crash
weeks before
investigation or whatever. Yeah, on Channel 7 and stuff like that.
Yeah. And it was really, it's the whole idea is that they talk about one type of like a specific flight for an episode. They talk about the series of events, so like what the pilots did, what the passengers did, what the staff members did, what failures happened on the plane, and what they think happened on the plane. At the end, it's like very like up in the air. It's like, well, this is what it suggests. What actually happened, we don't really know, and it's just kind of an interesting watch just to see how in like an event like this, people can do their best to either overcome something or what they do in these moments as well.
Cool. Mr. Porter, have you seen Loki yet? Or
I have, yes, and I would certainly recommend it. But yeah, it's great fun.
Definitely.
The MCU is the terrific piece of entertainment. It does worry me that it's tending to be sucking the oxygen out of all other movies and TV shows at the moment, but it's great stuff, and I absolutely love Loki, without a doubt. But I'm going to make my recommendation, and I suspect some of the students may have seen it before, but maybe not, because it's getting close to 10 years old now, is the, so on the aviation / space theme is the movie The Martian.
The Martian, yes.
And The Martian is fantastic because it's probably the best movie I think that's out there that is a modern movie that modern students will want to watch because it really shows what astronauts are really like. Okay, so I would actually avoid movies like Gravity. Gravity is actually a terrible depiction of what astronauts are like. Right, it's awful. Great special effects, but The Martian is a fantastic look at how real astronauts are really clever problem-solving people. Right, they will just work at a problem until they solve it, and they're very logical. And all got great senses of humor. Apparently, that's real. Astronauts are some of the funniest people you will meet. I've met a couple of astronauts in my time when I was involved in amateur astronomy. So I've shaken hands of the last man to walk on the moon. Actually, interestingly enough, he came to Australia a few years ago. Just like I was in a line of 100 people, so it wasn't anything special. But I thought it was pretty special. Harrison Schmitt. He was the last man to walk on the moon. He was on Apollo 17. So, so I'd recommend The Martian. If you're willing to cope with older style editing, another fantastic astronaut movie is The Right Stuff. But just kids, I would be wary of that because it's edited in a very much an old school 70s, 80s way, and you might find it a bit boring. Something interesting I'm noticing is that movies are edited much better these days than they were in the 70s and 80s. So 70s and 80s movies can seem very boring and long-winded to a modern audience. So with that caveat, that's another great astronaut movie, The Right Stuff.
Perfect. Thank you for that recommendation. I remember watching a YouTube video that was checking out the credibility of the science behind The Martian, and they said that other than the crazy, not going to spoilers, but other than the crazy storm at the start, everything else was quite scientifically plausible, including the way that he made food.
Not perfect. There's but you've got to tell the story, and so you can't always stick to the science. But definitely the way it portrays the astronaut mindset, really fantastic.
Perfect. Yeah, good old Matt Damon. So
I've got a lot of respect for him. He's
Definitely.
one of the, he plays lots of very interesting parts. I'm never bored watching Matt Damon.
Yeah, love Matt Damon. So my last recommendation for the day is recently in lockdown, my wife has been turning on Netflix to watch The Good Doctor. It was based off a Korean TV show of the same concept, which then they made it into an American version. The general premise is there's a surgical resident who's autistic on the spectrum, and so they talk about because of his autism, how he uses it as an advantage in surgical situations with his photographic memory and how he tries to problem solve. So a lot of it is very I wouldn't expect you to watch the show if you're planning to be a surgeon. It's quite a lot of it is quite dramatized. I know one little issue that I had with the show was like, I was like, you know what? A lot of these problems that these patients are having actually have very easy solutions, but the patients are just being irrational and making it hard. So for example, they'll be like, oh yeah, here's the solution. But then the patient will be like, no, we can't do that because it'll show scarring. And then my husband can see the scarring. And then it will show my years of infidelity, for example. And I was like, all right. So then they're going to think about how do they have to go around this giant circle, make things extra hard and extra complicated just to hide that. So that's the one irk I have about the show. But everything else, yeah, it's pretty nice. Yeah.
I mean, like, in a way, isn't that just like TV? It's like there's always like that simple solution, and then
Gotta have drama.
Yeah, I know, right?
Have
Can't
drama,
be so
there's
simple.
no drama.
Can't
it's
be
like
so
Pull
simple.
without
access
drama.
on I'm gonna still move in.
Yeah.
Woo.
Cool. So that is it for today's episode. Thank you so much, Mr. Porter, for hanging
You're
back
very
after
welcome.
school to talk to our listeners. Hopefully, when school is back, if you see Mr. Porter around the yard, you got any questions about his experiences and anything that he shared today, feel free to bring this up. But until then, we will see you all next week for another episode of the podcast. All right. Goodbye, everyone.
Live
Yeah.
long and prosper.
Yep, classic.